Yeah, I'll give you the argument, no issue. So we both agree that, at least under the Christian view, Jesus took on a second nature, which has properties that contradict his divine essence. Would you agree to that?
No, they don't
I
contradict.
said they're contradictory. I'm saying it's a contradiction insofar as the natures have properties that are opposing each other. We agree they're opposing properties,
Okay,
though?
so what's the contradiction?
I'll give you the argument. Do you agree that they're opposing or not?
By opposing, again, they are distinct. I don't know what you mean by opposing.
Opposing, yeah, I'll tell you what I mean, right? Meaning, you have the divine nature, he's going to be all powerful, omnipotent, and in virtue of his human nature, he's not going to be all powerful. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, they're distinct. That's
Yeah,
what
I
I'm
agree
saying.
they're distinct, but would you agree with what I said earlier?
Okay, look, the way that you just defined opposing is what I mean when I say distinct.
Okay, no
So
issue. Is it metaphysically possible for Jesus to take on a third nature? Third nature, meaning he takes on another nature.
All right, so the Muslims' objection is, could Christ have taken on a third, not only third nature, but sinful nature? So first, let's go through the first part of that. Could Christ have taken on a third nature? Is it metaphysically impossible? It is not possible for Christ to have taken on a third nature. Now, why is that? Well, first we have to understand the difference between essence and existence. So a lot of you are familiar with this. Essence is what a thing is, and the ultimate act of existence, esse, is that the thing is, right? Think of it in terms of like thinking of a tree in your mind as opposed to the tree actually having that ultimate act of existence, existing outside as an actual thing. Right? So in each individual person, what a person is they are an individual act of that essence, of that rational nature, right? If you have multiple acts, you have multiple persons, right? So for each substantial form or substantial potency, every essence, when I'm saying this, I'm saying every potentially existing individual in accordance with that specific essence, you have an individual act, which is what makes it an individual determinate thing, right? So when we say Socrates, Socrates is Socrates because he has that essence. You can think of it as a universal in that case. You have that universal essence, and then you have its individual existence as individual Socrates, and that is due to there being one individual, indivisible act of that particular existence. So it's very clear why I can't take on a second nature, right? Because a second nature can only be informed by a particular act. I already have my act of existence existing as, Juju, this particular human being. So therefore, I cannot take on a second act without splitting myself into two persons. Now, in the case of God, isn't God, taking on a second nature, and therefore would it not be a second act? Well, no, because remember, this is for every substantial potency. It must receive one act, right? Every individual essence, which could possibly be existing on its own as an individual thing, person, animal, whatnot. In God, God is pure existence itself. It is not a substantial potency, right? Because obviously there's no potency. It's pure existence. But remember, that same act can terminate in an individual substantial potency, substantial form, or right, an individual essence. So the human essence can be informed by this one act. So God, being act himself, pure existence, informs the substantial potency, which is the human essence, and in a way in which that essence has its individual act in virtue of that unlimited pure act, right? So it does not break our rule that for every substantial potency, it can only receive one individual act, because God, being pure act, is not a substantial potency. So it's not joining two essences in the normal sense. It's not joining an essence of God, two substantial potencies which can only receive one act. It's joining one essence, which is pure existence. It's not an essence in the normal sense of creation, and then a substantial potency. But remember, every substantial potency can only have one act, individual act. Now, this pure existence is the act of existence itself, which then informs the human substantial potency, and which gives it its particular existence, which allows Jesus Christ to exist as one person, because we're not splitting acts as in the case of Socrates, me or you, right? We can't join the divine essence with the human essence, right? Because we're not divine persons. We don't have the divine essence. So we have to get our own act of existence from God creating it. So it's a very clear and cut reason why Jesus cannot take on a third essence, because to take on another essence would mean to take on another substantial potency, but potencies can only be informed by one individual act of existence. If you had more than one individual act of existence in a substantial potency, then you would have multiple determinate things, in this case, multiple persons, if you had multiple acts. This is needed for clarification, because you might be thinking, well, isn't God already in his essence a determinate act in itself? Well, the point is that that act is determinate as his whatness, his isness, but it's not determinate in the same way, because his act does not terminate in a potency. But remember the metaphysical rule. For any substantial form to be individual, it needs its own act to terminate in the potency in order to actualize it. But notice how this doesn't apply to God by definition, because God is not a potency waiting for actualization. God is existence itself. He is the very act of existence. So that would just be a category error, because God himself does not inform the divine essence as separate from existence, which receives potency, or which receives act as in relation to potency, because God has no potency in that sense. So does not break the rule.
Other nature, which allows him to sin.
Well, no, the person of Christ cannot sin, no.
Show me within your worldview how it is a metaphysical impossibility for him to take on a nature which allows him to sin. Showcase that.
Okay, so first we have to clarify something for him, because we're going to try to rephrase his argument, because now that we know that Jesus couldn't take on a third human nature, let's answer the question anyways. Why couldn't he take on a second corrupted nature, a second sinful nature, as he put it? So let's clarify this. First of all, there aren't like two kinds of human natures, like a kind of human nature that can sin and a kind of human nature that cannot sin, right? A human nature is just that whatness, quiddity of that rational animality. So it's not like there's two separate kinds. The moral disorder is not a disorder of the nature simpliciter, it is a defect of a person. So moral disorder is not a separate kind of nature, like there's two kinds of human natures, one that can sin, one that cannot. Jesus assumed the exact nature that we did, the exact substantial potency. So what he's referring to is the corruption of the person. He's saying, why couldn't the human nature corrupt the person, Jesus Christ? And that is the question that we're going to answer. So again, remember, sin is a disorder of a person who acts through a nature. It is not some separate nature, like me and Jesus have just two separate natures, two substantial potencies. You got to remember that, because the question is already confusing categories when he says, why couldn't he take on a sinful nature? That is incorrect. We have the same nature. Sin is a moral corruption. Moral corruption is a corruption of the person. It is not of the nature simpliciter. So let's answer his question then. Is it metaphysically impossible for Jesus to have sinned then, assuming that he takes on, according to him, a second human nature? And why is it the case? Well, let's run a reductio for him right here. I'll put it up on the screen so you guys can follow along. Let's assume that Jesus could sin. Then Jesus could choose contrary to the divine will, but Jesus is the divine will. In reality, Jesus and the divine will are identical. Therefore, Jesus could choose contrary to himself. That means we would have a P and not P. Jesus would be himself. Jesus would not be himself, which is a contradiction, therefore proving that Jesus could not sin. Again, it is impossible, metaphysically impossible. It is not just the case that Jesus happened to choose not to sin. It is impossible. He asked how it would arise some sort of contradiction given your metaphysical principles, and that is exactly it. If Jesus is the divine will, and sin is a turning away from God, then for him to sin would literally mean for him to turn away from himself. But you cannot turn away from yourself unless you just cease being yourself. And so you would get a contradiction. Jesus is himself. Jesus is not himself. So there's a lot of distinctions that need to be made in this. It does get pretty sophisticated in terms of these distinctions in the will, distinctions in types of corruption, defects, and whatnot. But given these principles, it becomes extremely clear Jesus could not have sinned. It is a metaphysical impossibility of which, if you try to form it in this way, it will arise in a contradiction. I want to thank you guys so much for all of the support. Our GoFundMe is right there at about 50% now, and it hasn't even really been a week yet. So thank you guys. You guys have been so supportive to the channel, so supportive towards the streaming goals so that we can have better content come out, collaborations with bigger creators, and interviews and stuff like that. So again, guys, if you guys want to donate, the link will be in the description below. It's also linked to my channel. I'm going to close the GoFundMe around the middle of July so that I can start streaming towards the end of July for you guys, no matter how much is in the fund, if we haven't hit our goal or not at that point. But again, guys, thank you so much for all the support.